My name is Maribel Hensley. I'm 63. That afternoon, the sky over Charleston hung low and silver, the kind of light that makes everything porches. Magnolia leaves. Even the river looked like it's holding its breath. I was sitting at my kitchen table with a mug of lukewarm tea, double-checking the numbers on a bank transfer slip. It was meant for Clara and Ethan's honeymoon Belize. 7 nights. Ocean View Suite. The amount, $18,200, looked strange on paper. Too large to be coming from me, but it was what I'd promised. The phone buzzed beside the mug. One text. Mom, don't come to the wedding. Ethan says your presence would ruin everything. For a second. I thought I'd misread it. I tilted the screen, waiting for the words to shift into something else. Some smaller wound I could live with, but the message stayed there, neat and merciless. I'd been many things in my life: a wife, a widow, a secretary who balanced other people's chaos, but I had never been unwanted. My hand went still above the slip. Pen hovering mid-air. The kitchen clock clicked once, twice, loud enough to fill the room. I read it again. Don't come. The air in my chest felt thin, as if someone had opened a window I couldn't find. I tried to picture her my only child, the one I'd raised through storms and late bills typing those words. Did her fingers shake? Did Ethan stand behind her, watching, or did she send it calmly, with the same precision she used for her marketing emails? The kettle whistled faintly on the stove. A leftover habit. I turned it off. My tea had gone cold, but I drank it anyway because it gave me something to do. My reflection wavered in the dark window above the sink, tired eyes. A face that had learned how to stay composed. I wanted to cry, but the tears stayed where they were, like strangers behind glass. What surprised me most was the stillness. I didn't feel the rush of anger people talk about. Just a quiet ache spreading through my ribs. Slow and deliberate. Outside, a heron drifted low over the river. The house smelled faintly of lemon polish and laundry detergent. Everything was ordinary, and that ordinariness was cruel. My phone vibrated again. A new message from the bank confirming my appointment for the transfer the next morning. I stared at the reminder, then at the text above it. The two notifications sat together on the screen, as if they belonged to the same life. Maybe they did. I set the phone down gently, folded the transfer slip, and slid it into the drawer with my checkbook. The wood stuck halfway. Swollen from humidity, I pushed until it closed. Then I washed the cup, dried it, and turned off the light. The kitchen fell into shadow. The only sound, the hum of the refrigerator. I stood there a moment longer, the phone still on the table behind me, glowing faintly. Tomorrow. I was supposed to go to the bank. I would go, but not for the reason Clara thought. The next morning, Charleston woke under a gray drizzle that softened everything: the pavement, the palmettos, even the sound of traffic along King Street. I left the house early, coat buttoned high, the bank folder tucked beneath my arm. The air smelled of wet asphalt and magnolia sap. Inside the Charleston Bank of the South, the warmth felt too bright, too polished. A young teller smiled mechanically as I handed over my ID and the transfer form I'd filled out the night before. She typed in numbers that had already become meaningless to me: $18,200. The money that once felt like love now felt like ransom. Would you like to confirm the amount before we process it, ma'am? She asked. I nodded, though the paper blurred slightly. The text from Clara had burned itself into my mind, Mom. Don't come to the wedding. I saw it each time I blinked. The teller's nails clicked gently on the keyboard. The sound precise, detached, somewhere in the distance. A printer hummed and the scent of coffee drifted from an open door. I imagined the moment the transfer hit their account: Clara's laughter, Ethan's easy smile. Both of them relieved that the check cleared even if I didn't attend. I had told myself, for weeks, that the money was a gift. But standing there, I realized gifts were supposed to be given freely, not out of fear of being excluded. Please verify the destination, the teller said, rotating the monitor toward me. The hotel's name glowed on the screen, Belize Coral Bay Resort. My throat tightened. I could almost hear Ethan's voice describing it, the infinity pool, the ocean view, the champagne waiting in the suite. He'd said it as if it were theirs already. I took a slow breath. The pen felt cold in my hand. My fingers hovered above the signature line, then stopped. No, I said quietly. The teller looked up. I'm sorry, I shook my head, pressing the red cancel button on the touchscreen. It's not going through. She hesitated, professional mask slipping for just a second. Are you sure? Ma'am, you've already completed, I'm sure. I slid the folder back into my bag and offered a small, polite smile. Thank you for your time. Outside, the drizzle had turned to a thin mist. It gathered on my eyelashes, cool and clean. I walked slowly down Meeting Street, past the church spire, disappearing into the fog. The air felt lighter, as if something had been unclenched. At the corner, I paused under the awning of a cafe. My reflection in the window looked the same coat, same face, but the weight in my chest had shifted. I whispered the word without planning to. Perfect. And for the first time in weeks, I meant it. When Clara was little, she used to fall asleep on the living room floor, her cheek pressed against my knee as I graded papers from the school. I would let her stay there until the cramp in my leg forced me to move. Even then, I never carried her to bed. I just brushed the curls from her face and whispered, Go on, honey. Your pillow's waiting. She'd open her eyes halfway, smile without looking, and walk down the hall in that drowsy, sideways way children do when they still believe the world is safe. I became a widow at 34, the night my husband, Henry, didn't come home from the docks. I sat on that same living room floor with Clara in my arms, both of us too young in our own ways to understand what was gone. There was a knock at midnight, the kind that doesn't need to be answered because you already know. I went back to work 2 weeks later. The principal at Ashley Elementary said I was brave. But bravery wasn't it, it was survival. There were bills, uniforms, lunches to pack, a mortgage to keep. I took on extra hours at the front desk, balancing payroll and lost permission slips in the same breath. At night, after Clara was asleep, I balanced a different kind of ledger, a spiral notebook of our expenses. Every dime circled, every cent planned. Sometimes I'd open it just to remind myself that even if life wasn't kind, at least I could make it add up. Clara grew up in that rhythm, modest, predictable, steady. She never wanted for food, for books, or for love. I made sure of that. What I couldn't give her was glitter. She noticed it early, the girls with monogrammed backpacks, the birthday parties at the marina, the shiny shoes that didn't come from the outlet mall. She never complained, but I saw it in her eyes when we passed the boutiques on King Street. I told her that pride didn't come from price tags. She nodded, but she never quite believed me. The first time she brought Ethan home, I tried to pretend my heart didn't start beating faster. He was polite, smooth in the way people are when they've never had to rush. His car was parked outside Silver, low to the ground, humming like a secret. I baked a lemon pie, my best one, and watched him as he looked around the house. His smile didn't reach the corners of his eyes. Cozy, he said, glancing at the old oak table Henry had built before Clara was born. Reminds me of my grandmother's place. It wasn't cruel, not exactly, but there was something folded inside the words, a faint tilt of amusement when he added, You still use landlines here. Clara laughed softly. Mom's old-fashioned. She keeps everything. She said it lovingly, but the word old-fashioned clung to me like humidity. I smiled, poured him coffee, and kept my voice calm. Things that last are worth keeping. He looked at me then, half smile gone, and I knew he didn't agree. After they left that night, I stood at the sink washing the pie plate. The lemon filling had burned a little along the edge. I could still hear his laugh echo in the hallway, smooth and distant, like someone laughing in another room of a larger house. When Clara called later, she sounded lighter than she had in years. "He liked you, Mom. He said you're sweet." Sweet was a word people used for tea or for children, not for women who'd built a life out of empty cupboards and quiet faith. Still, I said thank you. As months passed, Ethan's presence became permanent, his shoes by her door, his opinions woven into her sentences. He didn't insult me outright. It was more delicate than that. A comment about how people our age struggle with technology. A joke about my thrift store sweaters. Each time, Clara laughed, and I told myself it didn't matter. Love, I thought, would teach him kindness. It would teach her perspective. I was wrong. Looking back, I can't tell when admiration turned to distance. When my daughter's laughter began to sound like apology. Maybe it happened slowly, one compromise at a time. One unchallenged remark after another. I wanted her to feel proud of where she came from. Instead, I taught her to hide it. That night, after the bank, I came home and opened the old spiral ledger I'd kept all these years. The pages were yellow now. The ink faded, but the numbers were still there. Proof of every sacrifice I'd ever made. The house was quiet, except for the rain tapping the windows. I closed the notebook and rested my hand on the cover, as if I could hold on to what I'd once believed was enough. It was nearly a week before the phone rang again. I was in the backyard cutting back the rosemary when the sound startled me. The number was unfamiliar, but I recognized the rhythm of the silence when I answered. Ethan always paused before speaking, as though measuring how kind or cruel to sound. "Mrs. Hensley," he began smoothly. "I hope I'm not catching you at a bad time." I wiped my hands on my apron. "What do you need?" "Ethan." A faint chuckle. "That's the thing, I don't need anything. I just wanted to clear the air a little. Clara's been, well, emotional. The wedding planning has her overwhelmed." He spoke as if he were soothing a child, not discussing the woman he planned to marry. I let him go on. She didn't mean that text the way it sounded. He continued, "You know how messages can seem harsher than intended." I could almost see his face, the patient half smile, the practiced charm. The drizzle had stopped, and the air smelled of wet soil and mint. A cardinal hopped along the fence, bright as a warning. "So you're saying she didn't mean it?" I said. He hesitated, the silence betraying him. "Not exactly. She just thinks the dynamic between you two might cause tension at the wedding. You've always had a strong presence. I told her we should invite you." Of course. He made it sound noble, as if he were championing a lost cause. My fingers tightened around the phone. "I see," I said. "And this call is your way of fixing things. I'm just trying to make peace." His voice warmed, almost confiding. "I know you've been helping financially, and Clara appreciates that. By the way, I wanted to confirm the transfer went through Belize, right? The hotel's asking about it." There it was, the real reason. Every word before had been scaffolding around that one question. "It didn't go through," I said quietly. "Oh," he laughed softly. The sound dry. "Probably just a delay. The bank can be slow." "No," I said again, this time firmer. "It won't go through. I canceled it." The silence on his end changed quality, colder, heavier. "I think you might be letting your feelings get in the way," he said finally. "This trip was important to Clara. I'd hate for her to think you're punishing her." "I'm not punishing anyone," I replied. "I'm just done paying to be unwanted." There was a sharp breath on the line, then nothing. For a moment, I thought he'd hung up, but he wasn't finished yet. "You know, He said, voice clipped now, sometimes it's better to step aside gracefully than to make everything about pride. I looked toward the garden, the small patch of green I'd tended for years without help. Pride, to me, was something that grew quietly, rooted deep, gracefully. I repeated, that's exactly what I planned to do. The line clicked dead. I stood there for a while, phone still in my hand, listening to the wind slide through the branches. Somewhere down the block, church bells marked the hour. Inside, I washed my hands, made tea, and sat at the table where my daughter's photo still stood in its silver frame. Her smile was young, untroubled. I turned the picture face down, not out of anger, but because I couldn't bear to see it just then. The house was quiet again, but this time, it didn't feel empty. It felt decided. The next morning, I woke with the kind of clarity that comes after too many restless nights. The rain had stopped, and Charleston was washed clean, wet bricks shining. The air sharp with salt and pine. I brewed coffee, folded the blanket on the couch, and gathered every paper that still tied my name to Clara's life, the insurance folder, the pension statements, the deed to the house on Rutledge Avenue, by 10. They were stacked neatly in my bag like soldiers waiting for orders. Mr. Larson's office sat above an old bakery downtown, the kind that still smelled of sugar and yeast. The hallway creaked as I climbed the stairs. I'd known Harold Larson for years. He'd handled Henry's estate after the accident. He'd been kind then, kind in that practical way lawyers learn to be when grief is still raw. He looked up from his desk when I entered, eyes squinting behind rimless glasses. Maribel Hensley, he said, standing with that deliberate Southern courtesy. Haven't seen you since... Well, too long. Please sit down. You look like a woman with something on her mind. I am. I said, I need to make sure no one can touch what's mine. His smile faded into professionalism. All right. Let's talk through it. I told him everything about Clara, the text, Ethan's call, the canceled transfer. I didn't cry, didn't dramatize. I just laid it out like an invoice for years of misplaced trust. He listened without interrupting, tapping his pen softly on a yellow pad. When I finished, he exhaled through his nose and leaned back. Well, he said, first thing, good on you for stopping that wire. That money's your safety net, not a wedding gift. He began pulling files, setting them in order. We'll start by reviewing your property deed. Then we'll update your pension account passwords. I'll add a beneficiary clause that keeps it locked to your discretion only. As for the house, let's place it in a living trust. That way, no one can suggest changes later on. His fingers moved efficiently, filling the quiet room with the sound of turning paper and the soft hum of an ancient printer. I found myself watching his hands, steady and deliberate, and realized my own weren't shaking anymore. He slid a document across the desk. Sign here to authorize updates. The pen was heavier than I expected. My name looked different this time, clean. Sure, not a relic of someone who signed out of habit. Larson glanced up. You're doing the right thing, Maribel. You'd be surprised how often good people end up unprotected because they trusted too long. I was one of them, I said. He gave a small, knowing smile. Not anymore. When the last signature dried, he placed the papers in a blue folder and closed it with a quiet finality. Everything's secure now. If anyone tries to move funds or claim authority, I'll know before they do. I nodded, standing slowly. The air in the office felt lighter somehow, and so did I. Outside, the sun broke through the clouds, scattering gold across the street. I paused on the steps, breathing in the scent of fresh bread from the bakery below for the first time in months. I felt the faint, unmistakable pulse of control returning steady, quiet, but alive. I tightened my grip on the folder and walked toward the car. the heels of my shoes clicking against the wet pavement in a rhythm that finally sounded like my own. The garden was always my refuge. Even after everything, I still found peace among the rosemary and lavender. The faint hum of bees steadying what the world kept shaking. But lately, even the air felt different, heavier somehow, as if the wind itself had learned to whisper. It started small, the way rumors always do. Mrs. Hayward from across the street didn't wave one morning. I thought she simply hadn't seen me. But the next day, she turned down the corner of Rutledge instead of passing my gate. At the market, I noticed it again, a sudden hush when I approached the produce aisle. The quick, sympathetic glances that never met my eyes twice. She embarrassed her daughter, someone murmured once, too close to the peaches for it to be an accident. Refused to support the wedding. Shame. Really. Poor girl. Poor girl. As if Clara were the victim. By the third week, it was everywhere, small-town politeness dressed as pity. Charleston had always been polite like that. Cruelty came wrapped in lace and smiles. The barista at the cafe stopped asking about my garden. The couple who rented the house next door crossed the street when I watered the front hedge. At first, I tried to ignore it. I told myself they didn't matter, but silence has a way of filling space until it becomes sound. I began to dread errands, the grocery store, the bank, even the morning walk to the post office. The city I'd called home for 40 years began to shrink, block by block, until it felt like there was no place left to stand. One afternoon, while trimming the overgrown jasmine, I heard the soft creak of my front gate. I looked up to see Mrs. Dunlap, my neighbor from 2 houses down, standing there in her floral dress and wide sun hat. She was older than me by at least 10 years, her posture still sharp despite the cane she carried. "Mind if I come in?" she asked. I nodded, grateful for the company, though wary. She sat on the stone bench under the fig tree, fanning herself slowly. "They're talking, you know," she said after a moment. Not unkindly. "About you and Clara. I've heard," I said, forcing a small smile. "Seems I've become the neighborhood's evening entertainment." She sighed. "You know how this town is. They don't need facts. Just stories that make them feel decent about themselves." I brushed dirt from my gloves. "What exactly are they saying? That you embarrassed your daughter, that you're bitter, lonely, maybe losing your mind." The words hung in the air like the smell of wilted flowers. "I see," I said. Mrs. Dunlap reached out, her hand warm over mine. "They're trying to isolate you, Maribel. People like Ethan, they're clever. They know reputation matters here. If they can make you seem unstable, they win twice. They get your silence. And they get your shame." I met her eyes. "Why are you telling me this?" "Because I've seen it before," she said quietly. "My brother went through the same. His wife turned the town against him until he started doubting his own memory." She paused, folding the fan. "Don't let them rewrite who you are." The cicadas started their late afternoon chorus, loud enough to fill the spaces between us. I felt something shift, then fear. Yes, but also resolve. I wasn't losing my mind. I was being erased. After she left, I stayed in the garden until the sky deepened into that soft indigo Charleston wears before night. The jasmine had overgrown the fence, reaching toward the street as if it refused to be contained. I understood that feeling. When I finally went inside, the phone was blinking a new voicemail. The robotic voice read the number before the message began. Clara's voice followed, brittle and polite. "Mom, I heard you've been talking to people. Please stop. You're making things worse. Ethan says it's best if we all keep some distance right now." Her tone was firm, rehearsed, almost foreign. She didn't sound like my daughter anymore. I deleted the message before it finished and sat by the kitchen window. Outside, the garden swayed in the dark, alive and untamed. Somewhere beyond it, voices were still talking, deciding what kind of woman I was. But for the first time, I didn't rush to defend myself. I just sat there, listening to the sound of my own heartbeat, steady and quiet, refusing to disappear. The call came on a Tuesday morning, just as I was making tea. The kettle hadn't even begun to whistle when the phone rang. Unknown number. I almost ignored it these days. Half the calls were strangers pretending to care about my warranty coverage. But something in me answered anyway. Mrs. Hensley. The voice was polite, professional. This is Melissa from Atlantic First Credit. We're calling to verify a new line of credit you recently opened with our downtown branch. My hand froze around the kettle handle. I don't have an account with you, I said. There was a pause, the sound of fingers clicking across a keyboard. Our records show a personal credit line, $40,000, opened last week. It lists you as the primary holder and an Ethan Graham as co-signer. For a moment, I couldn't breathe. Ethan? His name sounded almost unreal in that sterile tone. Can you repeat that? Yes, ma'am. It's under your name. Social Security ending in... She read the digits. Everyone was correct. Is there an issue? I set the kettle down and steadied myself against the counter. There's a very big issue. I didn't authorize that account, and I don't have a cosigner. Not now. Not ever. Her tone changed instantly, shifting from routine to alert. All right, Mrs. Hensley. Then we need to treat this as a potential fraud case. The rest of the call blurred into procedure questions, forms, promises to escalate the report. I took notes in my small spiral notebook, the same one I'd used for grocery lists and pension payments. When she asked if I could come by with identification, I agreed before the fear could take hold. At the bank, the air smelled of polished wood and faint cologne. A young man led me to a small office where Melissa was waiting, her smile careful, the kind reserved for people who've just discovered their life has been tampered with. She showed me the paperwork. My name sat neatly at the top, spelled correctly, written in black ink that wasn't mine. And there, at the bottom, next to a looping, confident signature, was Ethan's name, co-signer. I stared at it until my vision blurred. It wasn't just theft, it was invasion, the kind that creeps under your skin because it uses pieces of you to build its lie. Do you recognize the signature? Melissa asked gently. Yes, I said, my voice low, and no, it looks like mine. But it isn't. It's someone trying too hard to pretend they know me. She nodded, sliding a form toward me. Sign here to authorize the fraud report. We'll investigate and flag any linked accounts. My hand trembled as I picked up the pen. The irony wasn't lost on me signing my real name to undo a false one. Each letter felt heavier than it should have. But by the time I wrote the last curve of my surname, something inside me steadied. When I handed the form back, Melissa smiled faintly. We'll be in touch soon. And Mrs. Hensley, you did the right thing coming in quickly. Most people freeze. I've had practice, I said. Standing. Freezing doesn't help. Outside. The afternoon light hit the glass doors in a sharp, clean glare. I caught my reflection as they closed behind me. Tired eyes. Chin lifted. There was no trace of the woman who'd once begged to be understood. By the time I reached the car, my hands had stopped shaking. I dialed Mr. Larson's office, leaving a message about the fraud. My voice didn't waver once. At home, I opened my blue folder, the one he'd given me after we secured my accounts, and added a new section labeled Unauthorized Credit Line. I slipped the copies inside and sealed it shut. The house was quiet, the air heavy with the faint scent of garden soil. I looked down at my ink-stained fingers, the proof that at least one signature still belonged entirely to me. The envelope was cream-colored, heavy, the kind that carries more than paper. It arrived on a Thursday afternoon, slipped through the mail slot like any other letter. The return address read Charleston County Probate Court. For a moment, I thought it might be some routine notice, a tax reminder, or a pension form, but when I opened it, the world went silent. The heading was printed in bold black type, Petition for Guardianship and Property Oversight. Below it, my name, Maribel Hensley. And then there's petitioners Clara Graham and Ethan Graham. The words blurred for a second, and I had to blink to make them stand still. Alleged mental unfitness, risk of financial mismanagement, recommended guardianship to be appointed to next of kin. It felt as though the room tilted, the air thickening around me. The letter slipped from my hand to the floor. Landing beside the chair leg, I stared at it, unable to move. The sound of my heartbeat loud in my ears. They hadn't just taken my money, now they wanted to take me. The tea kettle began to whistle in the kitchen, shrill and distant. I walked toward it slowly, as if moving underwater, turned off the stove, and stood there with my hand on the counter. The cool tile grounded me, the small, ordinary texture of it reminding me that I was still here, still capable of boiling water, of thinking clearly, of breathing through the disbelief. When I finally sat down at the table again, I picked up the letter and read it from beginning to end. Every sentence was lined with insinuations. Recent erratic behavior, suspected confusion about finances, decline in social function, legal phrases dressed as concern, and at the bottom, a neat signature in black ink, Ethan J. Graham, co-petitioner and husband of daughter. It was the final cruelty pretending to protect me while planning to erase me. I folded the letter once, then twice, and slid it under the edge of my notebook. My hands were trembling, but not from fear. Something harder, sharper. I opened the notebook to the back pages, where I'd written down every bill, every receipt, every check signed in the last 3 years, rent, utilities, groceries, property tax, pension deposits, i.e., each one labeled, dated, balanced to the cent. I flipped through them slowly, the paper rustling like dry leaves. Every line of ink whispered proof I am lucid. I am responsible. I am not what they say I am. When the trembling stopped, I began a new list. At the top, I wrote in careful block letters, evidence for defense. Underneath it, I started recording everything that mattered. Copy of bank fraud report, email from Atlantic First, confirming account freeze, updated trust documentation from Mr. Larson, witness contact Mrs. Dunlap, property deed, medical records, last checkup, clean bill of health. The more I wrote, the steadier my hand became. Each name, each number, each memory reclaimed a small piece of me. By evening, the sun was falling low across the kitchen tiles, casting thin stripes of light over the notebook. I turned to the window and saw the garden glowing in amber. The jasmine swayed in the wind, undisturbed by the chaos of human betrayal. At 6, I called Mr. Larson. His assistant answered and transferred me immediately. Maribel, he said, his tone cautious but calm. I saw the court filing come through this morning. I was going to call you. So it's real, I said. Yes, but it's also beatable. You have records, you have witnesses, and you have me. We'll respond immediately. I exhaled slowly, gripping the phone tighter. They're saying I'm unfit. They're saying what suits their agenda, he replied. But courts deal in evidence, not gossip. And from what I've seen, you've documented everything. That's power, Maribel. Paper can lie, but paper can also defend. His confidence steadied me. I wrote down his instructions as he spoke. File a response. Gather notarized statements. Prepare for evaluation. The sound of the pen against paper became a rhythm, a heartbeat I could control. When we hung up, I stayed seated for a long time, The kitchen had grown quiet, the evening light dimming to gray. On the table lay 2 stacks of paper, their petition, and my defense. One sought to erase me, the other proved I existed. I gathered my notes into the blue folder Mr. Larson had given me months ago, the one labeled Personal Trust and Legal Protection. I slipped the petition inside too, not to keep their words, but to contain them. Outside, the first drops of rain began again, tapping gently against the window. I closed the folder and whispered to no one in particular, not yet, because I understood now they weren't just trying to take what I had, they were trying to take who I was. And I had spent a lifetime building that woman from the ground up. I wasn't about to let her vanish on paper. The days that followed moved with a strange kind of rhythm, half dread, half determination. I woke early each morning, brewed coffee strong enough to taste like resolve, and began the quiet ritual of assembling my defense. The dining table became my command post. Papers covered its surface, bank statements, notarized forms, witness letters, receipts so old their ink had turned sepia. I placed everything into small, ordered stacks. There was comfort in the neatness of it, the logic of proof. Numbers, dates, signatures. These things did not bend to opinion. Mrs. Dunlap came by one afternoon carrying a plate of cornbread and the calm steadiness of someone who'd seen worse storms. "You should have someone witness your daily routine," she said. "Sitting at the table with me. It'll help show you're capable, that you manage your affairs." I smiled faintly. "You mean to prove I can still boil my own tea and pay my own bills?" She nodded. "Sometimes that's exactly what it takes." She was right. The world loved paperwork more than people. That evening, I went through my notebook again, each page a small testament of survival. Rent receipts, check stubs, tax filings from the past decade. I found Henry's old accountant in the phone book, a man named Mr. Kavanaugh, retired, but still sharp. When I explained what I needed, he agreed to sign a statement confirming I'd filed every tax return on time since Henry's death. "I remember you," he said over the phone, "always precise, never a single error in your numbers." His words landed like small anchors against the tide of accusation. Next came the medical certificate. Dr. Sanders, my longtime physician, examined me in her office, tapping her pen lightly against her clipboard as she ran through questions. "Do you know today's date? The current president? Your address?" I smiled. "You've been my doctor for 20 years. Ruth. You know I could name every nurse on this floor and still remember the dosage for my cholesterol pills." She laughed softly, then grew serious. "I'm sorry you're going through this. I'll write exactly what I see: full cognitive function, stable mental health, and no indication of impairment." By the time I left her office, I could breathe again. At home, I printed new copies of the fraud report and the response to the guardianship petition. I read each line twice before slipping them into the blue folder. Mr. Larson had once called my insurance against betrayal on its front. I placed a white label and wrote in clean, deliberate strokes. Truth. Each document slid inside with a quiet finality. Bank records, property deeds, notarized statements, medical certification, and 3 photographs, one of the house, one of the garden, one of me standing at the gate. Proof of a life built, tended, and maintained by my own hands. At night, when the house went still and the crickets hummed outside the kitchen window, I began rehearsing. I stood by the counter, blue folder open before me, and practiced what I would say in court. "My name is Maribel Hensley. I am 63 years old. I live alone at 412 Rutledge Avenue. I pay my own bills. I cook my own meals. I am of sound mind and body, and I do not need a guardian." I repeated it again and again until the words no longer trembled. Sometimes, midway through the recitation, I'd picture Clara sitting in the front row beside Ethan, her hands folded neatly in her lap. I wondered if she'd look at me or keep her gaze fixed somewhere safe on the floor. The clock. The judge. The thought stung, but I didn't let it stop me. I knew this was no longer about being believed by my daughter. It was about being recognized by the world that thought it could erase me with a signature. When the final document was sealed and the folder snapped shut, I placed it gently in the center of the table. The lamp's glow caught on its plastic surface, making it shimmer like armor. I whispered the word again under my breath, truth, not as a plea, but as a vow. Then I turned off the light, leaving the room bathed in moonlight, the blue folder gleaming quietly in the dark like a sentinel guarding everything I still was. The courthouse smelled faintly of old paper and disinfectant, an odor that clung to everything. From the tiled floor to the hollow echoes of footsteps. I arrived early, clutching the blue folder like it was oxygen. Mr. Larson met me outside the courtroom, his calm presence steady against the hum of whispers that followed us through the hall. Deep breaths, he said softly, straightening his tie. We've done the work. Let the facts speak. I nodded, but my hands betrayed me. They trembled just enough to make the papers inside the folder rustle. Inside. The courtroom was colder than I remembered from my last visit years ago, when I'd signed Henry's estate papers. Now. The air carried something sharper judgment, waiting to be handed out. Ethan sat at the far table with his attorney, a young man in an expensive navy suit. The smug confidence on Ethan's face reminded me of that first night he came to dinner, when he'd laughed at my old phone as though technology could measure worth. Beside him, Clara sat stiff and small, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. She didn't look up when I entered. The judge, a middle-aged woman with kind eyes and a firm voice, called the session to order. Case 22-471 petition for guardianship of Miss Maribel Hensley, filed by Clara and Ethan Graham. My own name sounded foreign spoken from the bench, as if it belonged to someone else. Ethan's attorney rose first, oozing civility. Your Honor, this is not about malice. My clients are merely concerned for Mrs. Hensley's well-being. There have been reports of confusion, financial mismanagement, and erratic behavior. They simply wish to ensure her safety and the preservation of her assets. Mr. Larson leaned toward me, whispering. He's rehearsed that tone. Let him finish. The lawyer continued, gesturing toward me with the delicacy of someone handling a fragile relic. We have statements from acquaintances who claim Mrs. Hensley often forgets conversations and becomes defensive when confronted about her finances. We also have documentation of irregular activity tied to her accounts. I could feel my jaw tighten. Irregular activity. I thought, meaning the very fraud they had created. When he sat down, Ethan's lips twitched into a faint smile. It was the smile of someone confident the story had already been written. Then it was Mr. Larson's turn. He rose with unhurried composure, adjusted his glasses, and approached the bench with my folder in hand. Your Honor, what we have here is not concern, it's control. He opened the folder and began laying out the contents one by one, each paper landing with a soft but deliberate sound that filled the quiet room. First, he said, a notarized statement from Dr. Ruth Sanders, confirming Mrs. Hensley's full cognitive and emotional stability. Second, a record of all bank transactions from the past 3 years, each verified by her signature and time-stamped. Third, a fraud report filed by Mrs. Hensley against a false credit line opened under her name, co-signed by none other than Ethan Graham. The judge's gaze sharpened. She leaned forward slightly. Is that documented? Yes, Your Honor. Mr. Larson handed over the pages, We've confirmed the report with Atlantic First Credit. There's an ongoing investigation into the forgery. Ethan shifted in his seat, the smugness thinning. Clara still hadn't looked up. Larson continued, his voice even. Fourth, a notarized declaration from multiple neighbors confirming that Mrs. Hensley manages her household independently. And fifth, copies of her tax returns, verified by her former accountant, showing decades of consistent, accurate filing. The lawyer across the aisle tried to interject, but the judge raised a hand. You'll have your turn. Counselor. The silence that followed was dense, unbroken except for the faint creak of the judge's chair as she reviewed the documents. The courtroom lights reflected off her glasses, hiding her eyes. But her tone when she finally spoke was clear and sharp. This is extensive documentation. I see no evidence here of incapacity, quite the opposite. She turned her gaze toward Ethan's table. Mr. Graham, Mrs. Graham, do you have proof beyond your opinions? Ethan's attorney rose again, flustered now. Your Honor, the concern is behavioral, not strictly financial. My clients believe Mrs. Hensley's emotional instability poses a risk to her judgment. Larson's voice cut through like a blade. You mean she refused to fund their honeymoon? Because that's when this instability apparently began. A murmur rippled through the courtroom. The judge's expression didn't change, but her next words carried weight. I've seen petitions like this before, she said. They begin as acts of concern and end as acts of coercion. The court will not be used to legalize emotional manipulation. Ethan's face darkened. Clara's fingers fidgeted in her lap, twisting the small silver ring I'd given her when she graduated college. For a fleeting second, I thought she might speak, but she didn't. The judge signed a paper on her desk, the pen gliding swiftly. This petition is denied, with prejudice. Furthermore, I find the filing to be malicious in intent. Court costs will be assigned to the petitioners. If additional harassment continues, Mrs. Hensley may pursue civil damages. The gavel came down once, sharp and final. For a moment, I couldn't move. The words petition denied echoed like a bell in the hollow of my chest. Larson touched my arm gently. It's over, he whispered, but as I looked toward Clara, her face blurred through the thin film of tears I hadn't felt forming. She wasn't angry, she was ashamed, yet even then, she didn't meet my eyes. When the judge exited and the courtroom emptied, I stood alone by the table, the blue folder still resting where Larson had left it. Its label, Truth, gleamed faintly in the overhead light. I gathered the papers one by one, careful not to wrinkle them, as if gentleness could undo what they'd tried to destroy. Larson was speaking with the clerk, arranging the paperwork, but his words came to me as distant hums. When I finally stepped out into the hallway, the sunlight through the courthouse windows was almost too bright. I should have felt victorious. I'd kept my name, my home, my independence. The law had seen through their lies. But outside, when I reached the steps, I stopped. Across the street, Clara stood with Ethan. He was talking fast, angry, his hand gripping her arm. She turned once, just for a moment, her eyes meeting mine. Then she looked away. The wind from the harbor carried the faint smell of salt and rain. I tightened my hold on the folder, the one thing they couldn't twist or take, and walked down the courthouse steps slowly, one sure, solitary step at a time. For the first time in months, the house was quiet. No mail with seals, no calls from unknown numbers, no voices saying my name like it was a problem to be solved. The ruling had come down, final and public, and the city that once whispered now kept its distance. That Monday, a single message arrived from Clara. Glad it's done. No greeting, no apology, no warmth. Just those 3 words. I read them twice, then placed the phone face down on the table. The kettle began to hum, soft and distant. It should have felt like peace, but something inside me wouldn't settle. The kind of silence that follows a storm isn't peace, it's pressure. Each day passed in the same measured rhythm. I woke early, opened the windows to the river air, and tended the garden. The roses had bloomed late that year, soft pinks and bruised reds climbing the fence like they were determined to reclaim space. I trimmed them carefully, their thorns catching at my gloves as if warning me not to trust stillness. Neighbors began to greet me again, cautious at first, then kindly. Mrs. Dunlap waved from her porch. Even the mailman lingered a moment longer at the gate. On the surface, life looked mended, but I felt it, the quiet beneath the quiet. The way the wind would still before dusk. How the phone would buzz once and stop. How the nights seemed to hold their breath. I found myself listening too closely to footsteps on the sidewalk, to creaks in the floorboards, to the faint hum of the refrigerator that seemed louder than usual. I told myself it was exhaustion, nerves still unwinding from months of defense. Yet a small, stubborn instinct whispered otherwise. Trouble doesn't end with a verdict. It waits, like rain heavy in a gray sky. That evening, as I poured water over the last rosebush, I looked toward the gate. The street beyond was empty, the air thick with the promise of something not yet said. I left the hose running a moment too long before I shut it off. Then I stood there, hands wet and heart steady, waiting for the next sound to break the stillness. The letter came folded in half. No envelope this time, just slipped through the gate. Rain speckled and already curling at the edges. I found it early in the morning, resting on the porch beside the flower pot. At first, I thought it was another apology note from a neighbor who'd once believed the rumors. But when I opened it, the seal of the Charleston County Property Office stared back at me. Notice of temporary lien request property under review for potential financial risk. The words blurred as my vision adjusted, the ink bleeding faintly from where the paper had caught the drizzle. Beneath the legal phrasing, a familiar name appeared again. Ethan J. Graham, secondary claimant. For a moment, I couldn't breathe. My fingers tightened around the paper until it creased sharply down the middle. My house. Henry's house, the one we'd built room by room, paycheck by paycheck, was once again under attack. I stepped inside, letter still in hand, and let the door close behind me. The quiet was heavy, full of memories that pressed close. The smell of pine from the old floorboards, the faint perfume of the lilacs that always found their way through the open windows in spring. It all felt suddenly fragile, as though someone had already begun taking it apart in silence. I walked through the hallway, trailing my fingers along the wall. The paint was newer now, a soft ivory I'd chosen 2 years ago, but underneath it, I could still feel the uneven texture Henry had left when he plastered it himself. He'd laughed about it, said it gave the house character. His handprints were still there, invisible but real. Now, someone wanted to stamp over them with paperwork and greed. By the time I reached the kitchen, my chest felt tight. The table still held the faint outline of old water rings, the mark of a life lived, not measured. I set the letter beside the vase of roses and stared at it until the words steadied. Lien request. Such a simple phrase to describe theft in progress. When I called Mr. Larson, his voice was calm, but I could hear the fatigue under it. They filed a temporary motion. He said, "It's another attempt to pressure you. Nothing legally binding yet. I'll submit a counter-response today." I swallowed hard. "They won't stop, will they?" he sighed. "People like that don't stop until the law teaches them loss. But you're protected." Maribel. The trust we built around your property still stands. Still, I said. It hurts knowing they're trying. There was a pause. Then softly, of course it does. They're not just after the house, they're after the proof that you can stand without them. After we hung up, I sat there for a long time, listening to the soft tick of the kitchen clock. The letter lay between my hands, damp from the rain and my own touch. I could have cried, but the tears wouldn't come. Fury had taken their place, dry and controlled. I rose and began to move through the house again. Slower this time. The living room where Henry had built the bookshelf from reclaimed pine, the guest room that once held Clara's college boxes. Still faintly smelling of lavender and paper. The small sunroom I'd turned into a sewing corner, where the light fell just right in the afternoon. Every nail, every board, every memory was a language they'd never understand. They saw a deed, not the life it carried. By the time the light faded through the kitchen windows, I folded the letter neatly and placed it inside the blue folder behind the section labeled Property Documents. The folder had grown thick now, the weight of my survival accumulating page by page. Outside, the rain started again, soft and rhythmic against the roof. I stood at the window, watching it slide down the glass, and laid a hand on the wall beside me. Henry's wall, my wall. They could file all the papers they wanted. But I knew this house, its creaks, its scent, its heart. It was the last place on earth that still remembered who I had been before they tried to rewrite me. And I wasn't about to let it forget. The second hearing was smaller, quieter, just a procedural review for the lien petition, but somehow it felt heavier than the first. Maybe because I knew what was at stake this time wasn't only money or pride. It was the roof above me. The proof that my life still belonged to me. Mr. Larson had told me to come prepared but calm. We have everything documented. He'd said, still, human testimony carries weight. When we entered the courtroom, I noticed a familiar figure sitting near the back, Mrs. Dunlap, in her wide straw hat and floral dress. Hands folded neatly on her lap, she gave me a small nod. The kind that said, "Don't you worry now. Ethan was there again." Of course. With his attorney, Clara sat beside him, looking drawn and pale, eyes fixed on the floor. I couldn't tell if she felt guilt or exhaustion, but neither mattered anymore. The proceedings began. The county representative summarized the lien request, citing concerns of potential financial mismanagement. Larson stood to object, laying the paperwork on the table: trust agreements, updated pension transfers, proof of solvency. The judge skimmed through them, but her expression remained unreadable. Then Larson said, "Your Honor, with permission, I'd like to call a witness." Mrs. Dunlap rose from her seat. The clerk guided her to the front, where she was sworn in. Her voice was steady, that soft southern timbre that somehow made everything sound both kind and unshakable. "I live 2 houses down from Mrs. Hensley," she began. "I see her nearly every day. I've watched her tend her garden, pay her bills, walk to the market, and carry on with more sense and grace than most folks half her age." She smiled faintly toward me before continuing, her mind's sharp as a tack. "Your Honor, she's as capable as they come. The only confusion around her seems to come from those trying to profit off her peace." A murmur rippled through the courtroom. Even the judge looked up from her papers. Ethan's lawyer tried to cross-examine, but Mrs. Dunlap met every question with quiet precision. "No, sir," she said evenly. "I've never seen her forget a thing, not once. But I've seen people try to make her doubt herself. There's a difference." When she stepped down, the silence that followed was different from the usual courtroom kind. It was cleaner, less heavy, as though the air had remembered what truth sounded like. The judge glanced between the parties, then toward me. "Thank you," Mrs. Dunlap. She said, "That will be noted." Larson leaned over and whispered, "Sometimes one good witness is worth 100 documents." I didn't answer. My throat was too tight. As we left the courthouse, Mrs. Dunlap took my arm, steadying me on the steps. "They tried to make noise out of paper," she said with a small smile, "but you had roots." I looked at her, sunlight glinting off her hat brim, and felt something I hadn't in a long time, not victory, but belonging, the kind that comes from being seen, clearly, by just one honest soul. The courtroom was packed, this time reporters, clerks. A few curious neighbors who pretended not to recognize me. The story had spread faster than the truth could catch up, an old woman fighting her daughter's husband for her home. I sat quietly beside Mr. Larson, hands folded in my lap, blue folder on the table like a flag planted in familiar ground. Ethan entered late, his suit sharper than before, his expression carved into confidence. Clara followed behind, pale and withdrawn, clutching her purse as if it were a shield. She didn't look at me, though her eyes flicked toward the judge's bench once nervous, uncertain. The hearing opened with the usual formality. The county representative began, reading aloud the lean justification concern of property mismanagement and potential loss of value. Each word was cold, rehearsed, drained of humanity. When it ended, Ethan's attorney rose smoothly, all polished tone and false civility. "My clients acted only out of concern," he said. "Mr. Graham had been assisting his mother-in-law with her financial affairs. There may have been misunderstandings, but certainly no ill intent." Mr. Larson's turn came next. He stood slowly, adjusting his glasses. Voice calm but deliberate. "Your Honor, we've gathered additional evidence since the last hearing documents that demonstrate this concern was a pretext for control." He opened the blue folder. One by one, he laid out new papers, each bearing the neat black lettering of official records. "These are falsified financial filings submitted under Mrs. Hensley's name," he said. "Attached to them are electronic signatures traced to Mr. Graham's personal account. Here," he handed a copy to the judge, "is the metadata confirming it." The judge frowned. "Mr. Graham, how do you explain this?" Ethan shifted in his seat, his voice tightening. "Those forms were drafts. I was helping her manage her assets. She's not familiar with online systems." Larson didn't flinch. "And this, Your Honor, is a forged contract transferring partial ownership of the Rutledge Avenue property to an entity registered under Graham Holdings, LLC, established just 3 months ago." The courtroom went still. The judge's pen stopped moving. Ethan's lawyer opened his mouth, but before he could speak, Clara's voice cut through the silence. "He said it was to protect us." Every head turned. She stood abruptly, her voice trembling, but rising all the same. "He told me Mom was losing control, that it was just a safety step. I didn't—" She stopped, her breath breaking. "I didn't know it was fake." The judge's eyes softened, but her tone remained firm. "Mrs. Graham, are you confirming your husband submitted falsified documents?" Clara looked at Ethan, and for the first time, he looked afraid. His jaw clenched, his hand gripping the table so tightly the knuckles blanched. I don't know," she whispered. "But he made me sign things. He said it was to help." The room broke into murmurs until the gavel struck once, sharp and commanding. "Order," the judge said. "I've heard enough." She flipped through the papers again, then set them down with finality. "This lien request is hereby canceled, effective immediately. Furthermore, I am referring this matter for investigation under fraud and coercion statutes." The words landed like thunder. Ethan's composure cracked just a flicker, but enough. The corners of his mouth twitched, his eyes darting toward the exit. then to Clara, who was now openly crying. Larson gathered the papers calmly, sliding them back into the blue folder. His voice was soft but certain. "Justice takes time," he murmured, "but it always arrives." When the judge adjourned, I didn't stand right away. The sound of chairs scraping, murmurs rising, and papers shuffling seemed to come from far away. Across the aisle, Ethan sat frozen, his mask collapsing inch by inch. Clara reached for him, but he turned his face aside. I rose quietly, smoothing my skirt. As I passed their table, I didn't look at him. I only touched the folder against my chest, the word truth gleaming faintly through its plastic cover. Outside, the late afternoon light spilled across the courthouse steps. Clean and bright after weeks of rain, I drew a deep breath and let the air fill me, not as triumph, but as release. For the first time in months, the weight was no longer mine to carry. The story spread through Charleston faster than I could have imagined. The same mouths that once whispered, "She's losing her mind," now murmured a different line. She took them to court and won. For a few days, the neighborhood bloomed with awkward kindness. People who had once crossed the street to avoid me now waved from their porches. The barista at the cafe smiled too wide, sliding a free biscuit beside my coffee. Even the bank manager, who used to keep our meetings short, came out from behind his desk to shake my hand. It was all polite, performative, and hollow. Vindication always comes too late to feel clean. Ethan resigned from Graham Holdings the following week. The papers called it a personal decision amid ongoing review, but everyone knew better. His charm had curdled under scrutiny. The man who once strutted through social circles now couldn't set foot in the same restaurants without heads turning. Clara's name was kept out of the reports, though rumor filled in the silence with guesses, sympathy for her, pity for me. Neither felt right. She moved out of their condo quietly, leaving no note. One afternoon, her car passed my street. She slowed near the gate, but didn't stop. The jasmine was in full bloom then, climbing higher than the fence itself. And for a moment, I thought she might roll down the window, say something, anything, but the car kept going, and the sound of it faded like a voice swallowed by distance. I spent the next morning by the window, sunlight spilling across the table. The blue folder lay open before me, pages spread like chapters of a story I never meant to tell. One by one, I began to fold them neatly: bank statements, affidavits, transcripts, receipts of resilience. Each crease felt final, as though I were tucking away not just evidence, but pieces of the life that led here. When I reached the last page, the court's final ruling, I hesitated. The words were exact and unemotional, stamped with authority. Petition denied, lien rescinded, investigation pending, justice in black ink. I slipped it into the folder and closed the cover. The label truth had begun to fade from the friction of my hands, but it still caught the light when I tilted it just right. Outside, the wind rustled the roses. The world had gone quiet again, this time not with threat, but with distance. I had won. Yes, but in the hollow that victory left behind, silence felt heavier than before. The kettle whistled from the kitchen. I rose, poured the water, and sat again by the window. Across the street, the sky was turning the soft blue of evening, and for the first time in weeks, I allowed myself to breathe without armor. Justice had come, but it came alone. It arrived on a Wednesday morning, tucked among bills and catalogs. The handwriting was unmistakable, uneven, hurried, as though each letter had been written between breaths. Clara Graham, in faint blue ink. I stood by the kitchen counter for a long time before opening it. The envelope felt strangely fragile, as if the weight of what it carried might break it. Inside was a single page, creased at the edges. "Mom," it began. I didn't know how to stop him. I thought I was protecting us. I didn't see what it was doing to you until it was too late. I'm sorry. There was no defense, no plea for understanding, just those few sentences, written with the hesitation of someone who finally realized that truth can come too late to heal anything. The ink had smudged in one corner, maybe from a tear, maybe from uncertainty. I read it twice, then folded it carefully along its worn lines. For a moment, I almost reached for a pen. My mind filled with half-written responses, words of comfort, of exhaustion, of something like love, but my hand didn't move. There was nothing left to explain. The air in the house was still, on the table. The blue folder sat exactly where I'd left it, its corners slightly bent from use. I slipped the letter beside it, tucking it under the label that still faintly read truth through the window. The afternoon sun touched the edges of the roses outside, turning them almost gold. I stood there, watching the light shift, and felt the quiet settle. Not the kind that demanded answers, but the kind that forgave without asking for return. Spring came early that year, soft and fragrant. The roses along the fence had begun to bloom again, stubborn and bright against the fading evening light. Maribel clipped a few stems, arranging them in a chipped glass vase she'd kept since her wedding day. The air smelled of river salt and new beginnings. She carried her tea to the porch and set it on the railing. The wood was cool beneath her hands, worn smooth by years of seasons passing. Across the water, Charleston shimmered under a quiet dusk, the city lights blinking like distant promises she no longer needed to chase. For a long while, she simply stood there, listening. The hum of the harbor, the faint murmur of crickets, the rhythm of her own breathing. Everything had found its balance again. She reached for the switch beside the door. The old porch light flickered once before settling into a steady glow. Henry had wired it himself years ago, calling it their beacon home. Maribel smiled faintly. "This light isn't for waiting anymore," she whispered. "It's for peace." The tea had grown cold, but she didn't mind. She sat down, the roses beside her, the light steady above, soft, certain, and wholly her own.